Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hanadi Jordan, Communications Coordinator at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Joining us today is This Week regular Theresa Cardinal Brown to discuss President Biden's recent executive order on artificial intelligence and the efforts of the administration to attract immigrants to lead and maintain our competitiveness. Then we'll rebroadcast our interview with economist, veteran, and scholar Tim Kane, who speaks about why America is the immigrant superpower and how immigrants are necessary for our national security. Stay tuned. President Biden announced the executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence this past Monday, October 30th. The executive order, at more than 100 pages, covers a lot of areas, including ways to attract and retain people with expertise in AI and other critical and emerging technologies. The order requires various government agencies to act within their existing legal authorities in the immigration system to find ways that foreign nationals with necessary skills, education, and expertise can come to and remain in the U.S. But this aspiration faces potential obstacles, including a lack of support from Congress and outdated immigration policies that could set back this executive order. Joining us now to dive into the issue is Theresa Cardinal Brown. Theresa, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Hanadi. Happy to be here to talk about this.
So, Theresa, why don't you start off by giving our listeners a rundown of the intent of the executive order and what specifically the president asked government agencies to do regarding foreign nationals working?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, this is a broad executive order that is about beginning to set out a policy and strategy for the United States in terms of both kind of regulating the development and use of artificial intelligence and making sure that the United States can benefit, particularly as we see it as a strategic technology for us in the national security and international competitiveness realm. So it covers a whole lot of things, one of which is immigration. So the immigration pieces are really aimed at helping the United States ensure that we have the people that are necessary who have the education, training, and expertise to help us maintain a leadership position with regard to artificial intelligence and these other critical technologies. And this is looked at in light of not just economic competitiveness, because these technologies are sort of going to drive the next probably century of development in the United States. This is, a lot of people are looking at this like the next technological revolution, and it's going to change a lot of things. So how does the United States make sure that we maintain a leadership position in this? And that's important not just for economic competitiveness, but also there's national security implications, because these technologies are important for a lot of our national security, defense interests, intelligence, those kinds of things as well. So immigration is one way that we can attract and retain people who are, we like to say this term, the best and the brightest around the world, but that's really what we're looking to do. How do we recruit those folks? And there's all other sections that are about developing the domestic workforce here too. But as we've talked previously about on this podcast, the need is now. And the time it takes to train Americans to get there is we don't have. So immigration can kind of help get us there until we have the sufficient domestic workforce. But also can be a force multiplier in some ways, right? Immigrants who come in with innovations and ideas can help work with Americans to jump ahead in these technologies.
So you alluded to this, but I want to talk more about this aspect of the executive order, which is that this is kind of the first of its kind order and mandate request for government agencies to recruit talent from other countries. Usually this is a task left to higher education institutions, the private sector. So why this shift? I mean, this is the first of its kind as far as I'm aware. So yeah. Theresa, can you talk about what kind of has led to that shift, since it isn't traditionally how we recruit talent here?
Sure. It's worth understanding sort of the governmental role in this. So, for example, the Department of Commerce has an office that's whose job it is to go overseas and sell US products overseas. They support US exports because that's seen as an economic strategic priority for the government. So the government officials go help US companies market their products overseas. We also market people to come and do direct investment in the United States. The Agricultural Department also has an entity called the Foreign Agricultural Service that is about selling US agricultural products overseas. But we've not sort of done the same when it comes to recruiting talent and people. And I think part of that is just we haven't had to. The United States has been a destination of choice for foreign students and workers and immigrants for a very long time. And it hasn't been necessary for us to really sort of go out and suggest that people come here. They just do. But that's changing. And in part, it's changing because our immigration system is harder and harder to navigate. And so people with talents and expertise who are looking to go somewhere where that talent and expertise can be nurtured and used are increasingly looking to other countries. And other countries are increasingly actively soliciting and recruiting them. So to keep up, we kind of need to do the same thing. So one piece of the executive order is essentially telling the State Department to develop a program to identify people who have expertise and skills in these critical technologies and essentially recruit them to come to the United States. The government, State Department, and Homeland Security are tasked with creating basically advertisements and a website or other ways that we can tell people how they can navigate our immigration system to come and stay in clear and concise language, which I'm doing air quotes around clear because our immigration system is anything but clear.
Yeah.
And that's one of the struggles that we have. There are other parts of the executive order that are about trying to ease some of those issues, such as finding ways to allow people to move more easily from a student status to a green card by the way we interpret sort of the rules around visa categories. Like we have a category called an O1 temporary visa. It's a non-immigrant visa. In the jargon of immigration lawyers, they call it the outstanding O's, because the requirements are you have to be an outstanding person in your field to qualify for an O1 visa. And that's a pretty high marker. But one of the things that the executive order is asking Department of Homeland Security and USCIS to look at their policy guidance and say, hey, in light of how important these technologies are to the United States, maybe we could reevaluate what outstanding means for people in these fields. And maybe more people could qualify for that visa, right? So what leeway is there? What room is there to kind of tweak around the edges of our immigration system? Finding ways so that people who are already in the United States on a visa don't have to leave and make an appointment overseas and wait sometimes months before they can come back because their visa has expired and they need to renew it. Could they renew it while staying in the United States, right? That's something that the State Department is trying to look at. There was an announcement when the Indian Prime Minister was here several months ago about doing that. But now they're saying, can we do that for people in these fields? Other things that they're trying to look at are when we have exchange visitors. Those are the J visas that the State Department sponsors. Many of them are required by the terms of their visa to go home for 2 years before they can even apply to come and in a work visa or a green card or anything else because of the skills that they're studying. And that's because the United States has not wanted to essentially contribute to a brain drain of needed skills. But the president is now saying, well, we need those skills here. So maybe it's in our interest to try to get people to stay. So State Department, can you reevaluate that list, right? So things like that within existing regulations or policies that we can do to try to make our system a little bit more manageable because this is such an important national priority.
Well, something you talked about in your response is the confusion around navigating immigration law and the immigration system. And on that note, there's a lot of vague language in the executive order to some agencies. There's wording like consider changes, evaluate policies and programs. Why isn't the president, I guess, being more direct in this order?
So this is where you understand sort of what an executive order is in the panoply of legal and quasi-legal instruments, right? So the authority the president has comes from the Constitution and from statutes that Congress has passed. So our immigration law was passed by Congress, and that sets out pretty strict parameters for the categories of people who can come in on temporary or permanent visas, what the requirements for those visas are. Next, underneath that is regulation. So the law says this secretary of this department has the authority to implement this law. And so that secretary is responsible for writing regulations within the statute that set out processes, like how you apply for this, sometimes set out further interpretations of what the legislation says, if the legislation is kind of very high level. In essence, the regulations are directions to the agency and to people who would apply to the agency for the standards they need to meet. It's a little bit more, it's a next level of detail. And regulations are binding on the agencies and on the people who are applying. And they persist until another regulation is written to override it, to edit it, or to withdraw it. After that, there's sort of agency policies. So that is, if the regulation needs a little bit more guidance to the adjudicators on how to interpret it, that's what an agency policy is. It's not as strong, but it is, guidance that the agency has to follow. Where does an executive order come in? Executive order is the president saying to his government, this is the policy direction I want you to go. The president doesn't have authority to write those regulations themselves. The authority is vested with the secretaries of the departments. So the president says to them, this is the policy direction I want you to go. I want you to lean in on these things. And that tells the agencies how to issue their regulations and their policies. But he can't tell them, I want your policy to say this.
Yeah.
So that's why the language is consider doing this. Now, the secretary of the department or the agency might do this and go back to the president and say, sir, this would be the operational implications of doing this. This would be the potential downsides of doing this. They basically report back to the president, you've ordered us to do this. This is what we followed up on. It is a very strong mandate that the agencies have to respond to the president on this, right? Their boss has given you a task to do. So you've got to respond to the boss in some way. And usually it's completing the task, but sometimes it's, boss, this task that now that we've looked at it, maybe we can't do. Now, the agencies are usually involved when an executive order is being drafted. They get their input is solicited. So none of this should come as a surprise to any of the agencies that this was issued. But the next steps are all on the departments and agencies to do themselves.
So specifically, when it comes to hiring these specialized foreign workers, what limitations can we expect there to be within current U.S. immigration law?
Right. So as I said, the statute and the immigration law is pretty tight. And when I say tight, I mean it is very clear how many visas can be issued in any given year in a particular category, like the H-1B cap is a statutory cap. The president can't just decide to give more visas than the cap is available. He doesn't have that authority. Can't give out more green cards than are available in statute, right? Doesn't have that authority. Cannot give a green card to somebody who doesn't qualify in one of the categories that Congress has set out in the law. He can't create a new green card category. What he can do and what the agencies can do is say within this category and as it's described, maybe we can interpret something a little bit different that would include more people. We can define something a little different. Now, all of this is with, they say it's within their authority, but that can be challenged, right? And we've seen that over and over. Immigration regulations are challenged in court under something called the Administrative Procedures Act, right? And one of the ways you can challenge a regulation is, either the process by which the regulation was created didn't match the Administrative Procedures Act procedures. But the other thing you can say is this thing they're trying to regulate, what they've put in their regulation exceeds their statutory authority. They've gone beyond what the statute would allow them to do. So, they're trying to create wiggle room, right, within the statutory framework and see what they can do. But it is limited. At the end of the day, like I said, they can't create brand new visa categories. They can't add more visas if there's a statutory cap. They can sort of, again, tweak the system around the edges and hope that that is meaningful in some way.
So, Theresa, within this executive order, what skills are considered to be critical to the U.S., and how does the State Department plan on assessing and designating countries and skills on the exchange visitor skills list to meet those workforce needs?
Right. So, as I mentioned, the State Department, which manages the exchange visitor visa programs, one thing to understand about that, the reason State Department manages this is because it's seen as a foreign policy mechanism, right? It's called an exchange program. In other words, we bring people to the United States so that they can learn about the United States and experience being in the United States. And hopefully they'll take that back home with them and have a better feeling and view and opinion about the United States. And that helps us with our foreign policy. We create friends, right? That's what we hope to do. We create friends and allies through exchanges. And there are different categories of exchange visitors. Among those are researchers and scholars and academics. So that could include people that are researching these technologies or learning about these technologies. It also can include people who are in specific programs to develop, technologies. Because it is an exchange program and is foreign policy related, part of what they do is say to the countries that are sending people to the United States, look, we're not going to try to, if you have need for people with particular skills for your own economic development or your own priorities, we will make sure that they come home to you after learning in the United States. And the countries themselves are the ones that create the list of skills, and then the State Department publishes it. And if you're from a country and your country has designated one of those skills, and it's very detailed, it has occupational codes and it has industry codes and it's 3 levels down. So it's very complex. But if basically you're studying in a field that's listed on that list for your country, then when you end your exchange program, you can't change to another program. You can't apply for a green card. You can't apply for another visa without going home first for at least 2 years. It's called the 2-year home residence requirement. There are ways that can be waived. And so this may be something that the State Department is going to look at and say, they're either going to say, we're going to say to certain countries, yeah, these technologies, we're going to try to keep people here. Or they may say, we're going to expand the ability of those to be waived. And one way you can waive it is with a U.S. interested government agency. So if there's a U.S. government agency that says, I'm interested in this person and the work they're doing, that can authorize a waiver of that 2-year residence requirement and somebody can stay. So we'll have to see what State Department does with this, but it involves some foreign policy conversations with these other countries. And, the technologies that we're talking about and the areas and fields are defined in certain ways. So, for example, the executive order, there's been past lists that say the Defense Department has put forward that these are critical industries or skills or technologies that we find in our national interest to pursue and to protect. That's going to guide some of this as well. There are other things that they're looking to do. So one thing that also is in this that's not even DHS or State Department is there's an instruction to the Department of Labor to look at Schedule A. And I think we've talked about Schedule A on the podcast before. So if you're applying for an employment-based green card, your employer has to, for many of these categories, first do a recruitment domestically to show that they can't find a U.S. worker who's willing, able, and qualified for the job. And that has to be certified by the Department of Labor before you can go to USCIS and ask to sponsor this foreign worker for a green card. Schedule A is an authority that the Department of Labor has to designate certain occupations as being in shortage without you having to do an individual recruitment test. So the Schedule A has been around for decades. There's been some back and forth about it. It used to have more occupations on it. For the last 30 odd years, it's since the 1980s, 70s, I think, it's only had two. It's had nurses and physical therapists, which great for nurses and physical therapists. We need them, but there's probably a lot of other occupations that people might say we have needs, and these technologies are one of them. So the executive order explicitly tells the Department of Labor, hey, it's time to revisit this list. And I want you to revisit it with an eye to artificial intelligence, critical skills, and technologies. But also, by the way, there might be other occupations that we could consider for this list now too. So they tell Department of Labor that they have to go out and solicit input on what occupations should be part of Schedule A. So we may see some regulations put out there. Certainly they're told to put out a request for information to stakeholders about what should be considered as part of Schedule A. So we'll see if something comes of that. But it's the first time really in many decades that Department of Labor is being told to undertake an evaluation of Schedule A.
We've talked on this podcast before about America's workforce needs, sort of this gap in critical labor, and the role that immigration can play to support those workforce needs and bolster U.S. competitiveness. And we know that competitiveness issues are a top concern for members of Congress. And so I'm curious, how has Congress received this executive order? Do you think that this might lead to some uptake in legislation?
So it's interesting. I think for the most part, Congress is right now working on a lot of other things like funding the government and large supplemental appropriations.
Oh, yeah, that.
There's that. But I will say that this issue of artificial intelligence has been the subject of a lot of congressional interest. Senator Schumer, who's the majority leader in the Senate, has been convening essentially Senate-wide hearings on artificial intelligence and what kinds of regulations or policies we should have around it for months now.
Yeah.
Different committees in Congress have been looking at these issues, the Commerce Committees, the Science Committees, National Defense and Armed Forces Committees. There is a House Select Committee on strategic competitiveness with China that has been looking at this.
Yeah.
So we don't yet have a lot of legislative movement, but they've all been looking at this in different angles. And so I do think that you're seeing in DC this sort of convergence of the policy makers around, yes, we need to do something about this issue. And here's sort of the parameters that we need to look at it. And I think this executive order is a way of sort of focusing that. It's also kind of telling Congress, hey, here's what I can do, but if we want to do more, it's on you. You know, one of the requirements is that on the immigration side is that based on these new interpretations or policy changes, to create a report on how foreign nationals are using our immigration system. Are they able to come and stay if they're in these technologies? And I presume that one of the rationales for doing that, other than data is always good, is to help make the case to Congress that, hey, we've done what we can and it's still not enough because look how limited take up this is. I mean, we'll see. But it's to prevent that to Congress and say, hey, ball's in your court now. If we want to do more, you're going to have to do it. So, certainly there have been lots of conversations about how the immigration system might be needed to help with this. But like I said, this executive order covers a lot of different policy areas. So I just think it's one of those policy issue areas that is driving a lot of attention in Washington right now. And attention generally means there will be policy and legislative actions following pretty soon.
Well, what about the general public? What's their reaction been like to Biden's executive order?
Well, I'm not sure how much the general public has been paying attention to this. I mean, certainly anybody who's in this policy space is very aware of it. The White House has done meetings with stakeholders to talk about it, to say this is what our intention is. Can you help us out? The agencies will be reaching out as well to various stakeholders as they proceed with what they're doing. I think the hope is that for those who are in this policy space, that they will also help lean on Congress to say, hey, we've done our part, administration's done our part, it's time to hand off to you to do more. I think that the general public, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but I'll just say, like, in my immediate family, AI is something cool that you can go on the internet and make funny pictures of yourself and other people, right? Like the I think there's sort of this, hey, it's a cool kind of fun toy. Maybe it has like deeper issues that we should worry about in the future, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
But the people whose job it is to look at these things and whose job it is to see the future, see promise and peril in this technology, right? And so the question is, how does a government, when the companies are pushing the envelope all the time, how does a government sort of make sure that we are boosting the promise and mitigating the potential peril?
Yeah.
And that's what government should be doing, right? Looking at that. How do we make sure that we are getting the most benefit we can and mitigating what will be, because every new technology has downsides. And how do we do that? And that's what they're trying to get at.
I do want to add, for our listeners who might be interested, a few months ago, we did some polling, which found that Americans supported increased high-skilled immigration when paired with the understanding that it could be used to support U.S. competitiveness and national security. So check that out if you haven't.
So that rationale is one that the public will support.
Yeah. All right. Well, Theresa, that's all for this segment. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, as a nod to Veterans Day this week, we're going to talk about how immigrants have helped our military and national security. Stick around. Coming up at the end of this week is Veterans Day, when we honor all veterans of our armed forces. We've noted before on this podcast that immigrants have served in our country's military since the Revolutionary War. In previous podcast episodes, we've discussed how immigrants can bring needed skills to our military with attorney and retired Army Colonel Margaret Stock. Today, however, we're revisiting our interview with Timothy Kane, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, a veteran himself, and author of a book called The Immigrant Superpower. In his interview with Theresa from May 2022, Dr. Kane discussed why immigrants are integral to our national security, starting with his own experience in the military and meeting immigrants there.
And when I was at the Air Force Academy, I met a lot of friends from all over the country, different cultures, melting pot in a way is what the military is. And then I served in a particular branch of intelligence called human intelligence. So we're known as the guys that do combat interrogation and debriefings and, work with the CIA sometimes. It was a lot of fun. But what I found were some of the very patriotic Americans that do this very quiet work were foreign born. And they speak a different language at home. Their parents had often immigrated and they were second generation. But man, did they love their country. And so that was really my first taste, aside from the family stories, right? I mean, the Kanes are an Irish clan that came over here in the 1830s and 40s. And, according to Grandpa Kane, once they lowered the standards to let in the Irish, all bets were off. Like anybody can get into America. So, no, very proud Irish American family, fought for the North in the Civil War, really believed in this idea. And so it sort of shocked me to be introduced to nativism, whether it's on the left, which is more of an economic nativism, and worry about immigrants stealing jobs, or a cultural nativism more on the right. As you know, I identify as a Republican. But tell you what, serving overseas and meeting so many of our allies in Asia and the rest of the world that admire America and want to be Americans totally shaped my perspective, which is, I believe this country is the greatest in the world. I want it to continue being the greatest, most powerful country in the world. And Theresa, we need immigrants to stay powerful.
Dr. Kane named his book The Immigrant Superpower, and so we asked him why he thought immigrants made America a superpower in the world.
Core of The Immigrant Superpower is about how immigration is really a national security issue, not about domestic economics. It's about how our country was able to win World War I and World War II and go toe-to-toe with the Soviets and become a world-beating economy with all this technology that's rooted in innovation, which is driven by folks with immigrant roots, very entrepreneurial part of the American culture.
The subtitle of Dr. Kane's book is How Brains, Brawn, and Bravery Make America Stronger. In this section of the interview, Theresa asked Dr. Kane to talk about how immigrants bring those characteristics to the table and why that helps America.
What's fun about this, Theresa, is when you write a book, the real challenge is structure. Like, I knew I wanted those 3 chapters in there. Should I have made them chapters 2, 3, and 4 after the introductory chapter? I ended up putting them pretty far back after a lot of history. I don't know if I got it right or wrong, but yeah, if you only read 3 chapters, I think those are the most important ones, which offhand I believe are 9, 10, and 11. So, brawn. If we don't have immigration starting from the year 1790, and you just project forward, if we don't have immigration, our country is so much smaller. I think would be smaller than modern day Russia. But I know in World War II, the US would have been smaller than Nazi Germany, just in raw population size. And I would attest, you just don't have the underlying foundation of national security power. And we wouldn't have fought a 2-front war, Pacific and the Atlantic. We may not have fought at all because we wouldn't probably have had a lot of German Americans and wouldn't have cared what was happening overseas. Instead, George Washington set the standard to keep America open. So the brawn issue is just one of, what are the core ingredients to a nation's economy? And population is a key one. But you know what? It's not just raw labor. You want to have human capital. And that's where we get to the brains. And not just saying people with high IQ should come in. Brains means including all these other characteristics. And entrepreneurial inclination is one of those. People take the risk to uproot their family, to move to a different country. That's raw entrepreneurial risk-taking, risk-loving almost, to pursue something better. And it's why we see immigrants create, twice as many companies of all kinds per capita than the native-born, while they're integral to founding companies in Silicon Valley, for example. And it turns out, look at the bravery in combat. The Medals of Honor won by first and second generation immigrants account for roughly 45% of all Medals of Honor ever awarded. First generation alone, it's 20%. And as you know, there's never been our population being 20% foreign born. It's more like 10 to 15, sometimes 5. So we see they're punching above their weight, literally, in terms of taking risks heroically for their country.
In a prescient conversation, given the new announcement on AI that Theresa and I just discussed at the top, Dr. Kane spoke about AI and why competition for talent is a national security imperative.
I've just been a little surprised that it's been such a constant fight. And I think we're maybe in the last chapter of that fight because there aren't many groups to be unwelcoming to left.
That may be true. So you do finish the book with some prescriptions for reforming immigration, but it starts with a frame of preparation for war, which, given your military background and you talk about the immigrant superpower, it seems slightly prescient now that we are, again, facing somewhat of a renewed conflict with Russia over the Ukraine. But that framing puts a very different spin on traditional arguments about immigration. So, we said that you're economists. There's lots of examination of economics in this book. But in the end, you say, let's view immigration through a foreign policy and national security lens. Why is that important to you?
So one of the great stories that I was able to tell in the Immigrant Superpower was about my friend France Hong, who was a West Point graduate, but was started as a refugee, 2 years old, coming from Vietnam. Went to West Point. It's funny because his parents didn't want him to go. They'd had enough of war, and his mom tried to have him arrested on the day he left for the airport. But, police had to explain to her, he's 18 years old, he's allowed to make his own choice. I mean, that kind of patriotism pays off. France served in Afghanistan. He left the White House counsel's office to go fight again because he believed in helping people in Afghanistan, which reminded him of himself. So another story, looking back at U.S. history, was about President Harry Truman. in the wake of World War II, Truman authorized a program called Operation Paperclip to bring over Nazi scientists and engineers who could help build the weapons for possibly World War III. And the thought was whoever was going to win World War III would have the better Germans. Our German scientists were going to have to be better than their German scientists. It was a very cold, calculating move. And, that not politically correct approach prioritized defeating communism and defending freedom. Well, I think today, the war that potentially looms on the horizon is between tyrannical states like China and states that still believe in Enlightenment values like the United States and the West and NATO. So, the next war might be based on who has more Chinese AI engineers and scientists. And I hope to heck we have more. And I think we will win that future conflict. I think our system is better, but I also think immigration's key to that. And we need to take a lesson and a page from history.
With that, we'll wrap this edition of This Week in Immigration. It's also a wrap on my tenure as host of the podcast. I'm moving on from BPC, but the podcast is not going anywhere. As long as there is immigration news to share and discuss, we'll keep coming back. Thank you so much to our loyal listeners for joining us. We'll see you next time on This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. Send your comments and feedback to us at immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Hanadi Jordan. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Emily Vasquez, Hanadi Jordan, and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BPC Podcast is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.